Chapter 5. It's 3 a.m. Do you know where your demon is? Despite the unusual events of the day, Colin fell asleep quickly, curled up at the end of his bed. He dreamed of an old female werewolf who couldn't control her changes. She lived a long time ago in France. The dream was Colin's worst fear, not being able to control when the transformations happened and attacking people at will. In his dream, Colin always saw everything from the werewolf's point of view. He could feel the fear and helplessness as she fought against the change, but in the end the werewolf inside was too strong. It was hungry, and it didn't care who or what it ate. She was running, hunting a scared peasant man who was fleeing and shouting something in French. He smelled scared. His scent shifted abruptly, and instead he smelled of burnt meat. There was a blood-curdling scream, but it wasn't in Colin's dream. His eyes snapped open. He could still smell burning meat, like something was being overcooked. As the scream died down, Colin sensed danger. He didn't hesitate. He let the change rush through him, his growing form filling his bedroom as hair exploded from every pore, and his enlarged bones shifted neatly into their new positions. Muscles flexed and his senses swam, fixing themselves on the source of the smell and the scream that had woken him. It was Charles the demon floating in the middle of the room. Charles was referred to on the base as the soothsayer. His gifts included being able to see glimpses of potential futures. Charles wasn't pleasant to look at. He was a hideous creature with horribly burned skin, two small horns protruding from the top of his head, and eyes that were nothing more than dark, empty sockets. His pointy black teeth were bared as if he was growling at something, but whatever was troubling him, it wasn't Colin. The demon was staring at the corner of the room, and Colin suspected that Charles wasn't reacting to his dirty laundry hamper. Sure, the smell wasn't great, but hardly worth a blood-curdling scream. Charles. It was tricky for Colin to speak while in wolf form, and his words came out slowly in a deep growl. The demon looked around, startled, as if realizing where he was. He seemed out of breath and scared. Do demons get scared? Colin Strauss. He's coming. He's here, said the demon frantically, his sharp, raspy voice filling the room. Who? Barked Colin. Charles's whole body flickered and faded, and then he was solid again. I don't have much time, said Charles. He's using a hellstone. You have to stop him. Free the imprisoned. Save Elkwood. Charles let out another shriek. The demon looked to be in terrible pain as his shape shimmered and shifted and then exploded in a cloud of black smoke that filled the room and then vanished just as quickly as it had appeared. There was no trace to suggest there had ever been a former resident of hell floating in his room. What had Charles meant? Who was coming? What was a hellstone? Colin's bedroom door burst open and thunder rolled overhead. Colin's grandmother, hair wildly askew, stood in his doorway dressed in a pastel-colored floral nightie. Her white eyes crackled with electricity. What in the blue blazes is going on in here? She shouted. I'm trying to sleep and you're shrieking like a demon and shaking the house. Colin quickly pictured himself as a human and felt the power flee his body as he shrank down from a huge, hulking wolf beast. He grabbed the blanket from his bed and covered himself. Well, I don't want your excuses. I want a quiet house and a good night's sleep, without being woken up by intrusive floating demons or my werewolf grandson clawing at the walls. But Gran. Thunder rolled again and the glass in the window pane shook slightly. Good night, the old witch said, and slammed his door closed. Colin settled onto his bed and grabbed one of his notebooks and quickly scribbled down what Charles had said, writing a note beside each item. He's using a hellstone. What's a hellstone? You have to stop him. Who? Principal Sampson? Floating man from Seattle? Someone else? Free the imprisoned? Save Elkwood. How? From what? He placed the notepad back on his bedside table and curled up at the bottom of his bed. Colin tried to go back to sleep but couldn't. Charles's words echoed through his mind. With Silas gone, he wasn't even sure who to talk to. Becca will know what to do. He tried calling her cell phone, but there was no answer. Just a flat, no nonsense voice recording saying, leave a message or don't. I don't care. He sent her a text. Colin, you up? We got a problem. Need to talk. Now. Urgent. Like really urgent. Not joking. Very serious. He waited 10 minutes. 15. 20. 30. His alarm clock blinked 2 a.m. at him. Once, not that long ago, Becca had broken into Colin's house to recruit him for a crazy nighttime excursion. Colin decided it was time to return the favor. Not wanting to wake his grandmother again, Colin slid open his bedroom window and leapt to the ground, landing lightly in a crouch. He pulled his hoodie up over his head and broke into a run. Colin figured taking the long way around town made the most sense and would help him avoid any unfortunate encounters. The last thing he wanted was to run into Mr. Sampson again. Looping around the outside of town, across the football field behind the school, and through the edge of Elkwood forest brought Colin to the moors. The Emerson family farm sat on a large property at the center of the moors, edged in on either side by misty, rolling hills. Colin wasn't even remotely out of breath. He really wanted to turn into a wolf, but assuming the form of a large hairy beast didn't seem like the best way to sneak into a house. He leapt the small stone wall and ran into the swirling mists of the moors. The scents of the night floated to him: animals, wet grass, the occasional cow. Colin remembered all the smells in Seattle, and part of him pined to feel those sensations again. He had to get back on the night watch team. He just had to. Focus, Colin. Stay on track. The moon shone briefly through the clouds, reminding Colin he was only a few short nights away from his uncontrollable change. In 3 nights during the full moon he was going to turn into a werewolf, whether he wanted to or not. He pushed the thought away and concentrated on the task at hand. Colin skidded to a stop as the dark shadow of Becca's house loomed out of the mist. The Emerson's house was an old stone building that was far too big for Mr. and Mrs. Emerson and Becca. It had at least 6 bedrooms, a large study, a library, and entirely too many bathrooms. It had belonged to one of the founding fathers of Elkwood, who, as Colin had learned from the archives at the base, had actually been some sort of a half-tree creature. Becca hated the size of the house. She always felt like she was drowning in the emptiness. Colin located her bedroom window on the south side of the house and realized this was as far as he'd planned. He could hear the gentle rhythm of Becca's breathing as she slept, and further into the house, impossible to ignore, was the loud snoring of Mrs. Emerson. Colin was thankful Mr. Emerson had left with Silas. At least he didn't have to worry about anyone shooting at him. Now how do I get in? When Becca had broken into Colin's house, she'd used the patio door at the back of the house. The Emersons' home had no patio doors. He tried the front door, but it was locked. He went around the house and tried the back door when he caught a scent, something angry and old, and then heard the growl. The Emersons' guard dog, Bartholomew, lurched out of his doghouse in the back garden. The old dog, an Irish wolfhound, moved low to the ground and stalked toward Colin before stopping and raising his head. He sniffed the air, whimpered, and scurried back into his doghouse. This was the natural effect Colin now had on dogs since becoming a werewolf. Which was a shame, as Colin loved dogs, but they were all deathly afraid of him. No matter how many he encountered, they all immediately recognized that Colin was a much bigger, much more dangerous canine and should be avoided at all costs. Colin leapt from the ground to the roof and looked for a skylight, but found nothing. He leapt high into the sky, clearing the edge of the roof, and landed back on the south side of the house. He picked up some small rocks. Just a few light taps, something to wake her up. He judged the distance and the force required, and gently threw the first rock at Becca's window. The rock flew through the window like a bullet, putting a perfect hole through the glass. Oops. He heard Becca's heart rate increase and saw her bedroom light turn on. She slid open the window and leaned out. She was wearing a set of flannel pajamas and a sleeping mask sitting slightly askew on her forehead, which she fumbled with pulling it off as she approached the window. "Becca," said Colin. "It's me." "Colin? Why did you? How? What are you doing here?" "Step back, I'm coming up." Colin effortlessly leapt from the ground to her window ledge and perched there until she backed away so he could climb in through the window. "Sorry about the window," said Colin. "Is my mom still asleep?" asked Becca, rubbing sleep from her eyes. Colin could hear Mrs. Emerson's rhythmic snoring a few rooms over. "Yes, and snoring loudly. Are you okay? You look exhausted." Becca waved her hand dismissively. "Remember I said I'd been having deep sleeps? I asked your grandmother about it. She says it might have something to do with my powers as a witch developing. She says magic requires balance. Apparently I might be cursed to be really tired for, ever." Becca slumped down on her bed. Colin was about to try comforting her when he suddenly found himself very aware that he was standing in his girlfriend's bedroom. He'd only been in the Emersons' house once before, when Becca had convinced her father to allow Colin over for dinner. It was nothing short of a disaster. Although Mrs. Emerson was quite delightful, Mr. Emerson spent the whole time monitoring Colin, and Colin in turn kept a watchful eye and nose on Mr. Emerson in case he tried any funny business. Colin remembered all too well the time Mr. Emerson had tranquilized him and given him a drug that prevented him from changing into a werewolf for a short period of time. Maybe it was because werewolves were still new to Elkwood, or maybe it was because Colin had knocked out Mr. Emerson with a single punch. Whatever the reason, it seemed unlikely that Becca's dad would ever see Colin as anything other than a dangerous creature. After the dinner, Becca had decided that they should probably just spend time together away from the Emerson household. Consequently, Colin had never been in Becca's room. It was all a bit of a surprise. Not that he was standing there, but that the room looked so, what was the word? Girly. Is that a stuffed unicorn? Asked Colin. On a regular day-to-day basis, Becca dressed in dark clothing and had a bit of a goth thing going on. The last thing Colin had expected was pink wallpaper, stuffed animals, and floral bedding. Shut up, said Becca. No, it's nice. I just didn't expect it. 'Cause, you're so. Becca raised an eyebrow. So what exactly? Dark. Scary? Not someone you'd expect to own a stuffed unicorn? You're a witch. Colin blurted a little too quickly. My mom always wanted me to be a girly girl. She was disappointed when I turned out to be a necromancer. I keep this stuff to indulge her. Colin heard Becca's heart skip a beat. A lie. Colin smiled. You're listening to my heart, aren't you? Fine. I like the unicorn, okay? And I really don't mind the color pink. I just don't wear it. Is that what you wanted to hear? Colin held up his hands defensively. Hey, whoa, no judgment here. I think it's adorable. He sat down on the bed next to Becca and tickled under her chin. Who's a cute little witch? Becca punched Colin hard in the arm. Are you going to tell me why you decided to sneak into my room at this unearthly hour? We unicorn-loving witches need our beauty sleep, you know. Colin had gotten lost in the moment and had completely forgotten why he was there. Oh yeah, Charles the demon appeared in my room. That's not completely strange. He visits Elkwood all the time. Yeah, but I think he did it by accident. He was scared. He said he didn't have much time. He told me a couple of things and then vanished with a scream. I kind of think something has happened to him. What did he say? He said someone was coming. That he, whoever it is using a hellstone. That I had to free the imprisoned and save Elkwood. What's a hellstone? Asked Becca. I was hoping you'd know. Becca shook her head. Are you sure you didn't dream it? Colin got up and began to pace. No, my dreams are always full of horrible, tragic, violent memories of dead werewolves, demons appearing in my room, telling me to save people, and then vanishing in a puff of smoke is actually a nice change of pace for me. What do you think we should do? I think we need to make sure Charles is okay. Becca stood up. Well, that's easy enough, we just need to head up to the base. Colin grinned. Pink wallpaper aside, Becca was still that same thrill-seeking girl he'd fallen for. Always willing to venture out on a nighttime excursion. Out the window, dog boy, Becca said. I need to change. And we'll get there faster if you carry me, so why don't you do some changing of your own? Colin climbed onto the window ledge and looked back. Do you think we should bring the unicorn? In case you get scared. Colin saw Becca pick up the stuffed unicorn with the intention of flinging it at him. He quickly fell backward out the window, flipped around in the air, and landed lightly on his feet. He stripped down, reached for his inner werewolf, and felt the change flood through him. His senses sharpened, and in his mind the mists of the moors were swept aside, replaced with all the tiny details he could see, smell, and hear. In his wolf form. Pust. Colin. Colin looked up to see Becca, dressed in black leggings and a bulky sweater, perched on her window ledge. She carried a backpack slung over one shoulder, and her red hair hung loose around her shoulders. She looked every bit the young dark witch of Elkwood. Colin threw back his head and howled. Shua! Hushed Becca sharply. Sorry. From inside the house, Colin heard Mrs. Emerson roll over and then resume her deep snoring. Catch me, Becca said, and jumped from the window. Colin did as she said, helped her onto his back, and passed his clothes up to her so she could stash them in her backpack. He fell down on all fours and dug his claws into the wet ground. Becca held onto his large shoulders and he could smell her nervous excitement. They'd only done this a couple of times. As Colin imagined, it must be weird to use your boyfriend as a taxi, but at the same time Becca seemed to enjoy it as if it brought them closer together. Come on, let's go already. Colin leapt forward, gathering speed, the wind and mist swirling around them, as he headed north toward the base. It took a little less than half an hour to reach the old army base. Rather than taking the long way round to the north side to the main gates, Colin simply climbed the cliff face beneath the base and jumped the fence, landing in the middle of the training yard. A soldier Colin recognized as Matthews was guarding the front door to the main building and almost dropped his gun when he saw Colin. The man's heart rate went through the roof. Becca slid off Colin's back and threw him the backpack. "Oh, Miss Emerson, Colin, you gave me a hell of a fright," said Matthews. "Not used to big hairy creatures falling from the sky," said Becca. Colin hid behind one of the many large shipping containers that littered the yard and reluctantly let go of his wolfy side. His bones shrank and reorganized themselves, the hair shed and dissolved, and within moments Colin was a human again, a naked human. He dressed quickly and joined Becca, who was trying to convince Matthews that they needed to see Charles. "I'm sorry, miss, but the base is locked down as we're on a skeleton crew. Since Night Watch shipped out for Europe tonight. What do we do?" "I can knock him out. Considering how much trouble you're currently in, that seems like a bad idea." "What about Var's son?" asked Colin. "I expect he's asleep," said Matthews. "I'm sorry, but you'll just have to wait until morning." "How certain are you that something is wrong?" Colin knew what he'd seen. He could still see the panic on Charles's face when he'd appeared in his bedroom. What could such a scary-looking demon possibly be afraid of? "I'm certain. We think something might be wrong in Elkwood," said Becca, pleading a little. "We need to see Charles, it's urgent." "Sorry, miss, your father's orders." Colin could smell the resistance on Matthew. It smelled like cold concrete. The man was a good soldier. He wasn't going to disobey an order. "I'm sorry, Matthews," Colin said, and was about to knock the man unconscious when Becca placed her hands on either side of the surprised soldier's face. Wind began to whip through the yard, blowing Becca's hair around wildly. Matthews stood frozen. "Now listen carefully," said Becca, her voice taking on a deeper, terrifying tone. "You're going to fall asleep for exactly 2 minutes, and then you're going to wake up, not raise the alarm, and call Varson to let him know we've gone down to see Charles and that he should join us there immediately. Now, sleep." Becca let go of Matthews's face and the man crumpled to the ground. "Just how long have you been able to do that?" asked Colin. "Do what?" said Becca as she unclipped Matthews's security card. "You know, make people do what you want?" "Really, Colin? I'm a witch. I can always make people do what I want." Becca winked and slid the card across the security plate. The door swung open for them. They located the elevator and Becca pressed the blank button beneath the rest. That would take them to a separate plane of existence where Charles the demon lived in a vast cave. "Have you ever whammied me like that?" asked Colin, still in awe of his girlfriend's growing powers. "Whammied," said Becca. "You know, made me do what you want using your witchy powers." Becca kissed Colin on the cheek and took his hand. "Don't be silly. I'd never do that to you. Although I might consider it if you ever mention my stuffed unicorn again," she said with a sly smile. They both laughed, but it was short-lived as the elevator began to pick up speed and bend into another existence. Reality began to swirl and Colin's head swam while the contents of his stomach threatened to decorate the elevator walls. The first time Colin had taken this trip, he'd passed out. He'd been down here a few times since and hadn't passed out again, but he never got used to the horrible feeling. The elevator felt like it was in a free fall now, and Colin felt Becca's hand tighten around his. The elevator shuddered to a screeching stop. Fire was the single thought that occupied Colin's mind as the doors slid open and a swirling mass of flames rushed toward them. Becca screamed. Chapter 6. Fire Imp. Colin didn't even think about turning into a werewolf. When he revisited the event later, he concluded it must have been the adrenaline and the fear that had automatically triggered his transformation in the elevator, because the next thing he knew he was in full wolf form standing in front of Becca. shielding her with his back to the flames as wave after wave of intense heat swept across him. His last sensation before passing out was severe pain. He could smell the hair on his back burning and could hear his own skin crackling as it tried to heal and regenerate while being constantly cooked. An alarm had sounded somewhere, and some sort of high-pressured mist had shot out of the walls of the elevator. He clung to consciousness long enough to hear the elevator doors close behind him, and then he surrendered to sweet, painless sleep. Bright lights glared down at him as he awoke, and for a moment he thought he was dreaming. A lot of the wolf dreams, the memories of past wolves, began with him waking up in a strange bed while people talked in hushed, worried tones around him. And then he heard Becca. "Colin." She hugged him and touched his face and his chest. "You're okay." "I am? Where are we?" "The infirmary at the base," said the nervous voice of Elric Varson. "How do you feel?" Colin blinked a few times and his vision came into focus. He was indeed in the small 12-bed ward at the base. Soldiers occupied 2 of the other beds. Colin could smell burnt flesh and was acutely aware it wasn't his own. One of the base nurses, Helga, was busy hooking up bags of liquid and applying cold compresses to the soldiers. Becca sat on Colin's bed, smiling through tears and holding his hand tightly. Varson looked worried. It was the first time Colin had seen the base commander not wearing a suit. He was just wearing a plain t-shirt and a pair of pajama shorts, and his hair was a mess. "I feel fine." Colin pushed himself up onto his elbows. There was a dull tingle all across the back of his body, but he otherwise felt okay. "What happened?" "You saved me," said Becca. "I did. If you hadn't shielded Rebecca, she would have been incinerated," said Varson. "You were both very lucky. I really do hope this will be a lesson to you in the future not to go where you're not supposed to go. When I think of what could have happened." Varson trailed off and Colin could sense the stress coming off of him in waves. Under his command, Elkwood's teenage werewolf and witch, the latter being the daughter of Mr. Emerson, were almost killed. "It's fine," said Colin. "I'm fine, we're both fine. Everything will be fine." Becca wiped the tears from her eyes. It was terrifying. All that fire. "Charles? What happened to Charles? Did he do that?" "No," said Varson, snapping back to reality. "The soothsayer was not in the cave. It took us a few hours to get the fire under control, or whatever that thing is." "Thing? It wasn't just a fire," said Becca. "It was a creature." "The fire was a creature," said Colin, trying to wrap his head around it. "It's contained," said Varson. "It ended up burning itself out." "Can I see it?" "Maybe later," said Varson. "All we know at this point is that the soothsayer has vanished, and in his place was this fire creature." "So Charles is missing," said Colin. "I need to contact Night Watch and let them know what has happened," said Varson. "If you'll excuse me." Varson hurried out, the stench of stress following him. "How long was I out?" "Just under an hour," said Becca. "The elevator's safety features kicked in and got us back up to the base level." "It's a good thing you have a strong healing factor," Helga said as she busied herself tending to the 2 wounded soldiers. "I've never seen anything like it," added Becca. "You were healing as you were burning." "I remember the smell," said Colin, wrinkling his nose. "What happened to those 2? Becca looked over at the 2 soldiers. "They got pretty burned up trying to contain the creature." "They're ready for you now," Helga said to Becca. "I'm going to heal them," said Becca with a grin. Colin watched as she sat down on a chair between the 2 soldiers' beds and took one of their hands in each of hers and closed her eyes. Colin swung his legs over the side of his bed and stretched his back. Other than the sharp, cold pain from the scar on his back where Mr. Winter had stabbed him with a silver knife last year, Colin felt good. Not bad for almost being roasted alive. He'd have to remember to add this to his werewolf notes. Colin pulled on a pair of soldier's pants that had been laid out for him and pulled off the hospital gown, replacing it with a base-issue white t-shirt. He sat back down on the bed and watched Becca work her magic. Aside from the fact that Colin could still barely believe he had an actual, real-life girlfriend, he was constantly in awe of how powerful she had become. He made a mental note to ask his grandmother exactly when they were having training sessions because Becca's witch power seemed to be growing from week to week. "Done," said Becca. "That was fast," said Helga. They were surface burns, nothing too serious, just a matter of encouraging their skin cells to duplicate themselves much quicker than they normally would. They won't even have a scar. Thank you, Becca, said Helga. You two are free to go. We already contacted your mother and grandmother and gave them the cover story that we caught you making out near the base. A truck will take you back to the town. Commander Varsun will be busy writing up reports for most of the day. He requests that you attend school as normal and naturally not mention any of this to anyone until we have more information. Not even your grandmother, Colin. Naturally, said Colin, even though he thought it was a little strange being that his grandmother was normally privy to most of the secrets in Elkwood. Colin and Becca left the infirmary and headed down the hallway to the elevator. I don't suppose we could take the stairs for a change, said Colin. Becca laughed, but Colin was only half joking. Stepping back into the large metallic device where he'd almost been microwaved sent a flush of heat through his body, as vague memories of the event washed over him, and he suddenly had an urge to see the creature that had caused all this. Where is the fire creature being kept? 6th floor. Quarantine. I think they're going to evaluate it and then move it down to the cell blocks with the other prisoners. Colin wondered how best to suggest his next thought, but Becca beat him to it. You want to see it, don't you? Said Becca. I really do. I honestly can't say why, but I do. I thought it was cats, not wolves, that were naturally curious. Becca pressed the button for the 6th floor, and the elevator ascended. Silas had told Colin that the base held around 100 people, between the soldiers, doctors, and scientists who worked there. Beta team made up around 20 people plus Silas and Mr. Emerson, and Colin guessed they'd taken some support staff with them. So it was no surprise when the doors slid open and the hallway was empty. Anyone on this floor? One of the scientists, said Colin. He's in the washroom. How do you know? Never mind. Let's move quickly then. They hurried down a series of hallways until Becca led them into a large laboratory. Everything was clean and white and smelled like bleach. The lights were off except for a single spotlight in the center of the room that shone down on a large glass box that had been set on a table. The box was the size of a small microwave oven and had wires and leads running into it. Where is it? Asked Colin. In the box, said Becca. I thought it'd be much bigger, Colin said, remembering the swirling firestorm in Charles's cave. Colin could see fire burning inside the glass box, but as they approached he was surprised to see that the flames had a distinct shape. Inside the box was a creature made entirely of fire. Its head was the size of an apple and consisted of a round-shaped flame with 3 small indents where you'd expect eyes and a mouth to be. The body consisted of 5 much smaller flames that made up the creature's torso, arms, and legs. I heard one of the scientists refer to it as a fire imp, said Becca. It doesn't look dangerous. It looks sad. The fire imp was sitting on the floor of the box with its head hunched over. It heaved what seemed like a big sigh and then resumed staring at the ground. Colin tapped on the glass and the creature looked up and around, first at Becca then at Colin. Don't touch the glass, said Becca. Look. The creature hopped to its feet and floated over to where Colin stared, dumbfounded at the little creature. Colin tilted his head to try and get a better look, and the creature tilted its head the same way. He's copying you, whispered Becca. Do something else. Colin tilted his head the other way, and the creature mimicked his movement. Again, Colin raised his right hand and waved. The creature raised the flame on its left side and shook it ever so slightly. It's hard to believe that this tiny little thing did all that damage and almost killed us. Do something else, said Becca, obviously enjoying the show. Colin put his arm down and the creature copied him. Colin smiled a big smile and the indent in the creature's face widened into a smile. Colin stuck out his tongue and the imp opened its mouth and shot fire like a flamethrower, filling the box with a mini firestorm. Becca and Colin jumped back. Something beeped loudly, and white mist shot out of the bottom of the box near where the wires ran into it, dousing the flames. The mist cleared and the fire imp was lying on its back, coughing tiny smoke rings. It sat up and shook its head. That's amazing, said Becca. He's kind of cute, said Colin with a smile. Can we keep? Chapter 7. Stranger and Stranger. One of the base transport trucks drove Becca and Colin back to Elkwood. They sat at the very back of the transport the whole way and discussed the fire imp, how it might have got into Charles's cave and what might have happened To Charles. There was also a short discussion where Colin made a case for keeping a fire imp as a pet. Becca disagreed, making the very valid point that the imp was capable of burning down the entire town if it so much as sneezed in the wrong direction. But he was so cute, said Colin. Sure, but for those of us who can't naturally heal from severe burns, I'm thinking it wouldn't be cute for very long. Do you think it killed Charles? Becca shook her head. I don't think so. Charles is a demon. He lived in hell, which as I understand it is very hot. Fire isn't something that would hurt him. When he appeared in my room he said, "He's coming. He's here." Who is he? He can't have been referring to the fire imp. That doesn't seem like something that would scare a demon. And he said he was using a hellstone, whatever that is. The imp wasn't carrying anything. He's nothing but fire. Well, something's going on here. Charles vanishes. Your weird episode in Seattle and then again last night. And it all started around the same time. Our new principal arrived. You think it's got something to do with Mr. Sampson? Said Colin. It wasn't. Like the thought hadn't occurred to him either. I don't know, said Becca. But I definitely think we should keep an eye on him. The truck screeched to a stop outside of Becca's house. Mrs. Emerson stood on the front step wearing a floral dressing gown and a worried look. Are you going to be okay? Your mom's not going to be mad, is she? Nah, my dad is the real ball of anger in our home. Mom just worries. And if she gives me any trouble, I'll just, what did you call it? Magically whammy her. Becca wiggled her fingers for magical effect. Very funny. You're hilarious. See ya at school. Becca kissed Colin on the cheek and hopped out of the truck. 10 minutes later the same truck stopped outside of Colin's house. He glanced at the digital clock on the dashboard. 7:30 a.m. inside the house. He could clearly hear his grandmother banging around in the kitchen. It was faint, but he could also smell the scent of anger. She was probably upset that he'd disappeared on a nighttime excursion. Colin mentally prepared himself for the tongue lashing he was about to receive, hopped out of the truck and entered the house. And then when she was done shouting at me, she shouted some more, Colin said to Becca and Jeremy. The small school cafeteria was packed today as there was a torrential downpour of rain outside, possibly due to Colin's grandmother's current mood. Colin, Becca, and Jeremy sat at a corner table and ate their lunch. She was really that upset? Asked Jeremy. She's a lot more protective than she used to be. She didn't like me sneaking out in the middle of the night. Your grandmother scares me, said Jeremy. Don't worry, said Colin. She scares everyone. Not me, said Becca. I think she's awesome. You would, said Colin through a mouthful of his fourth ham and steak sandwich. Well, I've got to run, said Jeremy. Basketball practice. Catch you guys later. Jeremy grabbed his backpack and headed out of the cafeteria, the automatic doors swishing open for him as he went. Did you tell your gran anything? Asked Becca. No, but it felt weird keeping things from her. I just told her that you convinced me to sneak out for a makeout session and that you can't resist me. Becca slapped Colin on the arm. You did not. I absolutely did. You have self-control issues. Can't keep your hands off me. Colin grinned. Becca slapped him again. Oh, you'll pay for that, Colin Strauss. Just you. Wait, you do realize I have to train with that woman? It's not like there's an abundance of witches and wizards around here. Oh yeah, I've been meaning to ask. A couple of things, actually. The bell chose that moment to ring loudly throughout the cafeteria. Students began to clear out. Well, it'll have to wait, said Becca. After school. Sure, sounds. There was a crash as a tray skittered across the floor. A small boy, a couple years younger than Colin, with short blonde hair and bright blue eyes, was sprawled out on the floor. Gareth Duggan, his leg outstretched, sat nearby with his cronies, Kevin Hadfield and Ryan Munson. They were laughing uncontrollably. You should be more careful, new kid, snickered Gareth. You could have really hurt my foot, tripping over it like that. The boy on the floor looked on the verge of tears. Gareth stood up. Hey, I'm talking to you. Colin could feel the tension in the room. No one liked Gareth. He'd been the school bully for as long as Colin had been at Elkwood. He had made Colin's life a living hell until Gareth, who was part ogre, discovered along with the rest of the freaks in Elkwood that Colin was a werewolf. Since then he'd kept his distance from Colin but still liked to bully anyone smaller or weaker than himself, which was most people. "Hey kid!" Gareth shouted. Colin's hearing picked up the slightest whisper from the boy on the ground. "Keep control, keep control, keep control, keep control." Colin sprang up and walked over to Gareth. There was an audible gasp from the room. Gareth paled a little but stood his ground. Colin was at least 4 inches taller. The pair squared off, Gareth looking grim. "Got something to say, Strauss?" Gareth asked, but it lacked the venom he used to be able to throw behind his words. Colin could smell uncertainty and fear, along with the underlying ogre stench that poured off of Gareth. "Leave him alone," said Colin. "Or what?" said Gareth uncertainly. Colin leaned in close so only Gareth could hear him. "Or I'll eat you." Gareth turned another shade paler and took a step back into milk that had spilled from the new kid's tray. Gareth slipped, both legs flying into the air, and landed flat on his back with a thump. The cafeteria erupted with laughter. "All right," said Principal Sampson. Colin turned to see the stumpy principal standing beside the door, hands folded behind his back. "You all heard the bell. Let's get to class now. Come on, move along." The students began herding out of the cafeteria. Gareth scrambled to his feet and stormed out, shoving a few students aside for good measure. His 2 cronies followed close behind. Colin crouched down and held out a hand to the kid. "You okay?" "Why, yes," said the young boy. "Thank you." He took the hand and Colin helped him to his feet. Becca joined them. "You must be Terry," said Becca. "Why, yes," muttered the boy. "Come along, Mr. Barker," said Principal Sampson. "I'd like to have a quick word with you." Terry, head down, followed the principal out of the cafeteria, leaving Becca and Colin alone. "I recognize that kid's voice," said Colin. "I was zoning out in math yesterday and I could hear him hiding somewhere, muttering about having to control something. His name is Terry Barker. Just moved here with his mother. I overheard Dad talking about him over the summer. He's a telekinetic. He can move things with his mind. Very powerful apparently. Struggles to control it though. I know that feeling. Come on, we're going to be late for class." Colin and Becca passed Principal Sampson in the hallway. He was talking to Terry, who looked much calmer now. "Did you finish your English assignment?" said Becca. "Yeah, 10 pages on Shakespeare. Interesting guy. Not sure I like the frilly collar." Becca laughed. And then Colin's hearing cut out and he felt that same pressure in the air again. "Something's wrong," said Colin, but he couldn't hear his own voice. Becca had a worried look on her face. She mouthed the word "what?" and then a bunch of other stuff that Colin couldn't recognize. Colin's sense of smell cut out, too. He looked back down the hallway to see that Terry had gone, but Principal Simpson was watching Colin intently. He felt Becca's hand on his arm. With her other hand she pointed frantically down the hall. Students were spilling out of one of the classrooms in a panic. Colin glanced back to see that the principal had vanished. "What is happening?" Mrs. Walker, the chemistry teacher, scrambled out of the doorway after the fleeing students when something grabbed her from behind and dragged her back into the classroom. Colin's senses rushed back to him all at once. The fire alarm was blaring and the smell of fear in the hallway was intoxicating. Colin's heart was racing, but he quickly regained control and focused on not changing into a werewolf. Becca grabbed Colin's hand and pulled him down the hallway toward the classroom and flung open the door. Mrs. Walker lay on top of her desk. Micah Cross, one of the Goth twins, crouched over the terrified chemistry teacher in full vampire mode. Micah's pale skin was stretched tight over his face, making him look almost skeletal, and his jaw opened wide to reveal a set of long, sharp fangs. He hissed in Becca and Colin's direction and sank his teeth into Mrs. Walker's neck. The chemistry teacher screamed. Colin leapt at Micah, clearing several desks, and tackled him into the wall. But the young vampire was surprisingly strong. He grabbed Colin by the shoulders and effortlessly tossed him across the room. Colin twisted in the air and landed lightly on top of a desk. He could feel his wolf creature clawing to get out, but Colin knew that changing inside the school would be a bad idea. Have to get Micah out of the building. "Colin, can you hear me?" "Becca." "Yeah, what's happened to him?" Becca was crouched beneath the desk. Micah had gone back to feeding on Mrs. Walker, who was now unconscious. "He's in his true vampire form. I have to get him out of here." "I'll take care of Mrs. Walker." Colin jumped to the floor and ran at Micah. leapt at him again but hit nothing but air. 1 minute he was crouched there. The next he was gone. Colin landed beside the teacher's desk and spun around. A student's desk smashed into him, breaking into pieces and opening a wide gash across the side of Colin's head. Micah stood in the middle of the classroom, breathing heavily. He looked almost like an animal. He hissed again. Colin felt the wound on his head knit itself together and close up. Yay for werewolf healing powers. Micah, this isn't you, said Colin. Well, I guess this is actually you. But you don't have to do this. Micah moved so fast Colin could barely see him. The vampire picked up another desk and launched it at Colin. He caught it this time and threw it right back. But Micah was running around the classroom in a blur. Colin picked up Mrs. Walker and carefully laid her down on the floor behind her desk. Becca scrambled over. Are you going to be okay? Said Becca. Can you handle him? Colin shrugged. I'll go find out. Micah had come to rest halfway up the wall in the back corner of the room. He hissed again. What's with all the hissing? Said Colin. Are you a vampire cat? He leaned back on the teacher's desk and focused on his hands, specifically his nails. Colin had been practicing hard with Silas to master partial changes like growing claws or increasing strength in one part of his body. Colin had managed it to various degrees, some of which made Silas laugh because there's nothing funnier than a teenage boy with one wolf ear, one wolf leg and one very hairy arm. Colin's hand and nails grew into sharp claws, which he dug into the desk. Behind him, Micah scrambled along the wall like a spider and hissed again. I'll tear you limb from limb, wolf, spat Micah, his voice deep and gravelly. The vampire sprang forward, moving with exceptional speed. But Colin was ready. This time, he gripped the heavy solid teacher's desk with partially changed hands and swung it like a baseball bat, smashing Micah's body and launching him out through the window. He landed 60 feet away on the football field. Colin dropped the desk, which was badly bent and broken, hopped through the window, and ran to Micah as he struggled to his feet. His skin was no longer stretched, his teeth were normal again, and he was looking more like himself, somewhat dazed. Colin could hear the sirens of the local police and army vehicles from the base approaching. Are you okay, Micah? Asked Colin. Micah rubbed his head. What happened? What did I? His hands went to his stomach. Why do I feel so full? Micah suddenly looked ill. Colin placed a hand on his shoulder to steady him, and then came to a terrible realization. Oh, I make vampires sick. Micah promptly vomited all over him. Varsun straightened his tie and patted Colin gently on the shoulder. You did very well in subduing him without killing or eating him. Really well done. Yeah, go me. I managed not to eat the crazy, puking vampire, said Colin. The football field was filled with army personnel. Local police who were really nothing more than soldiers in a different uniform, had taped off the area. Principal Sampson had dismissed the other students early and, fortunately, the only people to see Colin hit Micah like a baseball was Becca. The rest of the students had fled out the front of the school and been magic to believe it was nothing more than a fire drill. Micah had been taken up to the base for examination. Why did he change like that? I've never seen one of the Goth twins lose control, said Colin. The boy claims he wasn't in control. He was sitting in class and then all of a sudden he felt an overwhelming thirst for blood. Well, he is a vampire. Yes, but he's a well-fed vampire. The Cross family are supplied with fresh animal blood on a daily basis. Micah hadn't shown any signs of withdrawal, and he claims he had no control over himself when he attacked you. He doesn't even fully remember what happened. Is he going to be okay? I mean, you're not going to lock him up and throw away the key? Said Varsun with a sideways glance. Colin shifted uncomfortably. He'd been in the base prison. It wasn't a fun place to be. He was also very aware that he was naked from the waist up, his hoodie and shirt ruined by vampire vomit. Becca approached and handed Colin a spare sweatshirt from his locker. Thanks. How's Mrs. Walker? She'll be fine, said Becca. She'll probably be traumatized for life, but she won't have any long-lasting effects from her bite. So she won't be turning into a vampire anytime soon, said Colin with a grin. It doesn't work like that, said a female voice with a thick European accent. Colin and Varsun turned around to see Mrs. Cross, Nathaniel, and Micah's mom standing 10 feet away. I'd come closer, said Mrs. Cross, but the werewolf smell is too much for me. to deal with. Understandable, said Varsun, adjusting his tie awkwardly. What my boy did, I am sorry. This was a new side of Mrs. Cross for Colin. The only time he'd really seen her before was when she demanded the town let her hunt for Silas. Then the two of them had fought at the town hall meeting. Apparently she was really old. Pretty hot for an older woman. Colin. Sorry, Becca. Thinking too loud. It's quite all right, said Varsun. It doesn't appear to be his fault. Phew. Want to head up to the base? You'll be able to take him home as soon as we finish examining him. Mrs. Cross was there 1 minute, gone the next. Colin caught the slightest glimpse of her as she blurred away across the field. Mrs. Walker and Micah are both lucky you two were there, said Varsun. Yes, very lucky indeed, said Principal Sampson. Colin and Becca spun around to see the principal standing behind them. Colin hadn't heard or smelled him approach. He was like a sensory blind spot, and it was driving Colin crazy. Ah, Mr. Sampson, is the school clear? Indeed it is. All students accounted for and sent home. They'll only remember it as a fire drill, nothing more. We'll make sure the classroom is repaired by tomorrow. Excellent, said Varsun, adjusting his tie again. Thank you for your assistance. Principal Sampson nodded politely and turned and walked away. Not one sound of footstep. No crunch of gravel underfoot. So annoying. Varsun, can he be trusted? Asked Colin. What? Said Varsun, looking surprised. He's always there just before something weird happens. Oh, believe me, said Varsun. You don't have to worry about Mr. Sampson. We're very lucky to have him. You two should get on home. Varsun turned and went to speak to one of the soldiers who had been taking samples from the spot where Micah had hit the ground on the football field. What do you think? Colin asked Becca. I think if I could just lay one finger on Principal Sampson, I could learn a lot, said Becca, smiling. Oh good. I have a plan, said Colin, confident. Chapter 8. Kinetic. Colin actually didn't have a plan, but he wanted to sound cool in front of Becca, so he spent a good part of the evening after dinner trying to come up with a way for Becca to lay a hand on Principal Sampson. One of Becca's new powers was the ability to get a glimpse into people's minds when she touched them. She was still learning to master it, but if she could touch the principal, she might be able to get a glimpse at who he was and if he had anything to do with all the weird goings on. Colin tried reaching out to Silas, but the distance must have been too far. He couldn't get so much as a growl out of his old mentor. Colin hoped he was okay. Chasing rogue werewolves around Europe wasn't exactly the safest way to pass time. Colin's grandmother had gone to bed early. She'd barely said anything over dinner. Colin wasn't great at reading the old lady, but something seemed to be bothering her. He tried to ask how her day was, but she just dismissed it with a wave of her hand. Varsun had also called to ask if Colin had made a decision about the full moon. Colin was still undecided. Only 2 nights until the first full moon. Time was ticking. But this Principal Sampson thing needed to be sorted out first. Varsun trusted the weird little man, but it was all too much of a coincidence. Principal Sampson had been around the night Charles disappeared. And then right before Micah went all Dracula. Maybe he had been in Seattle, too? Is Principal Sampson the floating man with the glowing red eyes? Colin had written his suspicion in one of his many notebooks, but he had no way to prove yet. Then there was the issue with Colin's senses going all weird. Was it just part of his werewolf transformation, or was it something more? Was Principal Sampson doing this to him? Or was Colin just not able to deal with being a werewolf? Should he go camping or just let Varsun lock him up during his change? He picked up his phone and texted Becca. Colin, camping trip. At a loss. Do I go or not? Colin continued planning how to get Becca in a position so she could get closer to Principal Sampson, but he didn't have to wait very long for a reply. Becca, your call. Colin, what about Jeremy? Becca, what about Jeremy? Colin, you don't think he'll find it strange when I turn into a giant wolf creature each night? Becca, I've got it taken care of. Colin, explain. Becca, tomorrow. Don't worry, wolf boy, I got your back, winky face. 333 XXX. Colin read the last message again. XXX. Kisses? I do have a plan. When Colin went down for breakfast on Wednesday morning, his grandmother was already gone. A scrawled note said she'd gone out on urgent business. What is she up to? It wasn't like his grandmother to go out unless there was a town hall meeting. She certainly didn't go out in the morning, as that was when all her favorite TV shows were on. Colin put the issue to the back of his mind and ate 2 bowls of cereal, 8 pieces of toast, and a piece of raw steak that he didn't even bother defrosting. Only one more night until his full moon change. Colin was beginning to feel anxious. He met Becca and Jeremy at the front of the school as a light misty drizzle floated down from the sky. He kissed Becca on the cheek and put an arm around her. So I was just talking with Jeremy about going on a camping trip this weekend, said Becca. Said Colin somewhat dubiously. Aren't you going to be heading out there tomorrow night? I mean, we have school, so we wouldn't be able to join you until Friday, but it might be fun for a couple of nights. Yeah, said Colin a little more enthusiastically. What was Becca playing at? Sounds like great fun, said Jeremy. Oh yeah, totally, said Colin. But, if you'll recall, I had a few concerns. Oh right, said Becca. Jeremy, Colin is worried that you're going to see him turn into a giant werewolf every night. How do you feel about that? As long as you don't eat me, said Jeremy, laughing at his own joke. I'll just have to think of a good excuse to tell my parents. I got to get to class. I'll catch you 2 lovebirds later. Colin watched Jeremy leave. Making a joke about it is all well and good, but I think it'll be a slightly different story when I actually turn into a werewolf at night. Becca took Colin by the arm and guided him through the gates toward the school. You forget who you're talking to, young Mr. Strauss. We'll all hang out during the day, and then before you change, I'll simply put Jeremy to sleep for the night and cast a protection spell around the camp. So your solution is to magically drug our friend into a deep sleep? Yes. So he doesn't discover that I'm actually a giant werewolf? Yes. Colin thought about it for a moment. That's genius. I'm not just a pretty face, Colin hugged Becca tightly. Of course not. You have lovely hair too. Becca hit Colin playfully as they entered the school through the automatic doors and headed toward English class. What are you going to tell your mother? Asked Colin. Becca shrugged. I'll tell her I have to work with the medical staff at the base for the weekend. She won't question it because I've done it before, and with Dad away, she's planning on having a quiet few days at home anyway. Don't you feel bad lying like that? Asked Colin. It's a small lie, said Becca. Mom would really prefer to believe we live in a nice, normal town, and that her only child isn't a witch. I think she lives in denial sometimes. Okay, I'm in, said Colin. I'll camp alone tomorrow night, and then you guys can join me. I can do this. We can do this. We're in it together. Just, don't eat us, said Becca with a smile. I'll do my best. The school buzzed like it normally did, and no one would ever have suspected that there was a vampire attack yesterday. Students were too busy complaining about the usual stuff that teenagers worry about. Hair, boys, girls, acne, clothes, teachers, homework, and so on. So what's the big plan? Said Becca. You'll see. You're not going to tell me? I think it'll become obvious very quickly. Colin opened his locker and took out his books for English class. He could smell a sense of nervousness in the air. He closed the locker and looked down into the eyes of Terry. The 10-year-old stared up at Colin, who was easily over a foot taller. Hi, Colin, said Terry. Hi, Terry. How are you feeling? Oh, better, I guess. I just wanted to thank you for helping me yesterday. Yeah, don't worry about it. Gareth used to make my life hell too, so I know what you were going through. Terry brightened up a little. Really? How did you make him stop? I was bitten and turned into a werewolf, and then I ate my biology teacher. I just stood up to him one day, said Colin. Wow, you're brave. Oh yes, he's very brave, said Becca sarcastically. Terry turned a dark crimson color at seeing Becca. I've got tea to go. Bye. Terry took off down the hallway, careful not to look at Becca. You scared him, said Colin. I did not. Must be the red hair. That's not what happened. What did you smell? Colin laughed. I think he has a crush on you. Oh, come on. You're lying. Honest truth. And he wasn't lying. As soon as Terry noticed Becca, his scent had changed from nerves to embarrassment to confusion and back to nerves. His heart rate had also increased. Colin knew the signs well. He'd experienced them himself around Becca not even a year ago. I'd be more comfortable if he was scared of me, said Becca. I don't have anything to worry about, do I? Shut up. The bell blared down the hallway, ringing in Colin's ears. They made their way to English class at the south end of the school and took their seats next to each other. Their teacher, Mr. Abernathy, was an old gentleman who was set in his ways and didn't like to teach anything new. He also had a melodic drone to his voice that made you instantly want to sleep. Since discovering the truth behind Elkwood, Colin had often wondered if Mr. Abernathy was some sort of creature that made people sleepy. Mr. Abernathy was also a traditionalist, which made his the perfect class to execute Colin's plan of attack on Principal Sampson. The class quieted down as Mr. Abernathy called everyone to order and began droning on about Shakespeare. "PST," said Colin to Becca. "Did you just PST at me? Ever been sent to the principal's office?" "What? No, I'd never." Colin placed a hand on the back of Becca's head and kissed her. The class gasped. Becca pulled away. "What on earth are?" And then she saw the angry and shocked look on Mr. Abernathy's face. "Oh." Becca grabbed Colin's face and kissed him back full on the lips. The class broke out in an uproar. People whistled. Some students laughed, a few cheered them on. "Stop that right this instant," shouted Mr. Abernathy. But they didn't. Much to Colin's enjoyment, they just carried right on making out in the middle of class. "Colin Strauss. Becca Emerson. I demand you stop kissing immediately." The class exploded in laughter. "This is not a laughing matter," said Mr. Abernathy. "This is outrageous." Colin stopped kissing Becca and grinned. "Sorry, Mr. Abernathy. You were saying something." The smell of anger and disgust floating of Mr. Abernathy was powerful. The old man's face was so red it was practically purple. Colin began to worry he might explode. Mr. Abernathy scribbled a note and handed it to Colin. "Both of you report to the principal's office immediately." Colin and Becca quickly gathered their things and left the classroom. They could still hear the irate English teacher complaining as they walked away down the hall. "Never in my years of teaching have I ever witnessed such a disregard for English class. This isn't Italy. You can't just start kissing in the middle of class. The cheek of it. Shakespeare would not approve of such things. In my day, if your plan was to get us to the principal's office, we could just have gone and knocked," said Becca. "Yeah, but this way was more fun," said Colin with a wink. Becca sighed. "Boys, you realize we're never going to be able to sit together in English class again." "That I actually didn't think about at all. Smart idea though, getting us into his office. It's an enclosed space. Easier to touch him. If he's truly afraid of germs, you're going to have your work cut out for you." "I'm sure I'll think of something." Colin's senses went blind again. All sense of smell vanished and it was like someone hit the mute button on his hearing. At least this time he had Becca with him. He stopped walking and looked at Becca. "It's happening again." "Your senses? Hold still." Becca placed a hand on Colin's forehead and closed her eyes. Colin felt the familiar sensation travel through his body. It was like someone pouring hot water through his veins, both comforting and scary. Becca was searching his body, looking for something to heal. "Wow. What is it?" "It's a spell. Hang on a second." Colin felt the heat rush to his head to the point where it began to hurt, and then his senses flooded back to him. Becca released his head and smiled. "A spell. Someone cast a spell on you," said Becca. "And not a simple spell. It was complex. Planted directly into your head." "How did you undo it?" said Colin, slightly in shock that someone had been practicing magic on him. Casting a spell is like tying a very difficult knot. Undoing one is just a matter of finding the right thread to pull. The spell in your head was complex, but it was rushed, like it needed to be cast quickly. It was easy to find the right thread to tug on. Colin felt a dark sense of dread. He really didn't understand magic, or that someone could have this sort of effect on him. It worried him. How long has it been in there? It's impossible to tell. Could have been there since Seattle and it just gets reactivated when needed. Or it could be planted fresh every time. Colin was beginning to feel more and more violated. But who would do it? Someone powerful. It's called rune magic. It involves the creation of magical symbols. It'd take me hours to even start putting something like that together. Maybe your grandmother. Or maybe the old man who lives in the woods. How do you know about Alfred? They arrived at the principal's office and the door swung open automatically. To be continued. Principal Sampson sat behind his desk, hands folded in front of him, grinning. That cheerful grin he was so fond of wearing. Mr. Strauss and Ms. Emerson, please come in and take a seat. To what do I owe the pleasure so early this morning? Good morning, Mr. Sampson, said Becca, taking a seat. Morning, sir, said Colin. He held Mr. Abernathy's note out to the principal. Principal Sampson stared at the note and chuckled awkwardly. If you'll please. Excuse my peculiarity, Colin, I'd rather not touch it. Germs, you see. Phew. Can please just place it down on the desk, that'll be just fine. Colin looked at Becca, who was busy smiling at the principal. He unfolded the note and placed it on the desk. I have an idea. I'm all ears. We need to irritate each other, start a fight, and force him to get between us. Now let's see, said Principal Sampson, leaning over the desk to look at the note. Disruption of class due to inappropriate behavior. Oh my. We kissed, said Becca. Sort of made out, said Colin. Oh dear, said Mr. Sampson. Mr. Abernathy is a bit of an ancient soul. In more ways than one. That sort of behavior certainly wouldn't sit right with him. It's Becca, said Colin. She can't keep her hands off me. What? Snapped Becca. Colin grinned stupidly. Despite discovering someone had magically manipulated him, he was still having too much fun with this. Now look here, said Mr. Sampson with a bit more authority in his voice. There's a time and a place for such things. And that time is not during school hours, and that place is not in Mr. Abernathy's English class. Would biology class be okay? Asked Colin. Seems fitting. No, Mr. Strauss. No school class is appropriate for such things. You're such an idiot, Becca said and hit Colin hard on the arm. Ow! Abuse! Colin cried. If you hadn't decided to try and suck my face off in English, we wouldn't be here right now. Okay, let's all calm down, shall we? Began the principal. Well, maybe if we made a little more time to kiss outside of school, it wouldn't have happened. Colin fired back. You just can't help yourself, can you? You're like a wolf on the prowl, shouted Becca. Good one. Thank you. Well, what about you? Said Colin, standing up. You come into school every day looking gorgeous. It's like you've bewitched me or something. You're a witch. Mine was still better. Principal Sampson stood up but stayed on his side of the desk. Now listen. Both of you. Becca pushed Colin. Colin pushed her back. Please, both of you. There's no need for name-calling and a shoving contest. Becca pushed Colin. Stop it. You stop it, said Colin, shoving her back. Why isn't he stopping us? I have no idea. I'm just going to go for it. Becca reached across the desk and Principal Sampson's eyes went wide with fear. He staggered backwards, but the room was too small. There was nowhere for him to go. That's when a school locker smashed through the door of the office and stuck there, half in the office, half in the hallway. What on earth? Said Becca. Something's wrong, said Colin. You think? I'm just looking at the evidence at hand, said Colin, gesturing to the wedged locker. Principal Samps, began Becca, but he was gone. Completely vanished. Where did he go? Said Colin. Who knows? What's going on? Colin closed his eyes and cast his senses throughout the school. He could picture hallways and classrooms. Everything was in chaos. Books, desks, chairs, lockers, even a few students were flying everywhere, getting thrown around. The school is under some sort of attack. Objects are moving by themselves. Telekinesis, said Becca. Terry. The automatic door tried to open but couldn't due to the locker sticking through it. Colin kicked the door off its hinges and he and Becca ran out into the hallway. Students and teachers were screaming and trying to flee from the building as the whole structure began to shake. Can you track him? Asked Becca. Colin inhaled deeply and his brain tried to sort through the different scents. Got him. He closed his eyes and focused in on Terry. Colors sprang together in Colin's mind, painting a living picture of Terry lying on the ground, his arms covering his head. He was muttering something about control, begging something to stop. I have to get to him. Go, I'll be fine. Colin took off down the hallway, moving around scared students and dodging the numerous airborne school supplies that swirled around the building. A locker flew off the wall at a terrified young girl. Colin threw himself in front of her, and the metal locker clanged into his back and fell to the ground. Run! Colin shouted at the girl, who complied. Teachers were trying to lead students to the nearest exit, but everyone was too scared to move in an organized fashion. Colin pushed aside the smell of fear and panic and focused. He passed a group of students huddled together on the ground and almost collided with Jeremy, who was busy putting his books in his locker. Colin skidded to a halt. "You all right, Joe?" Colin asked, surprised by how not panicked his friend was. "What?" "Yeah," said Jeremy. "A bit weird, all this. Another fire alarm. We just had one yesterday. The stuff floating about, though, you don't find it weird?" "Floating stuff? Colin, are you okay?" "Am I okay?" Colin shook his head and took off at a run. One weird problem at a time. Colin crashed through the door of the biology lab before it had a chance to swing open by itself and slid to a stop in front of Terry. Chairs and desks swirled around the room and Colin had to duck to avoid getting hit. "Terry, it's me, Colin." Terry looked up, his face streaked with tears, blue eyes shining bright. Colin could smell the rage floating off him. It smelled like mustard. Anger always smelled like mustard for some reason. "You have to stop this," Colin said. "People are going to get hurt." I didn't do this." "Terry, you have to stop." His anger increased and Colin took a step back. Terry balled his fists and screamed, "I didn't do this." The world around Colin exploded. It felt like a train had slammed into him as he was thrown back. He felt the wall behind him collapse as he was pushed through it, and then all went quiet. Darkness crept in around Colin. The last thing he heard before everything went black was Terry gently sobbing and muttering, "I didn't do this." Chapter 9. Now you see me, now you don't. Colin was having a serious sense of déjà vu. For the second time in as many days, the school was closed early and the norms, and even the freaks, were all magic to believe it was nothing more than a fire in the biology lab. "I wonder if all this magical brain stuff has any long-term effect?" asked Colin. "What do you mean?" said Becca. They were sitting on the school steps waiting for Varsun to bring out Terry. The final few students who hadn't been picked up by family members were being loaded onto Elkwood's only school bus. I mean, every time everyone has to get magic to believe something that's not true, how do we know they're not going to eventually end up a drooling vegetable? Well, the alternative is that all the normal people would know exactly what's going on in Elkwood. "Would that be so bad?" asked Colin. It's something that occasionally bothered him. Maybe because he was once a norm himself, or maybe because it just didn't seem fair to keep people in the dark. "The human brain," said Becca. "The normal human brain can't handle certain things, like knowing you're living in a town full of monsters and magical creatures, for example." "Then maybe Elkwood shouldn't allow any norms," said Colin. "But it's part of the cover of the place, and as weird as that sounds, helps keep everyone in order. I heard there was a place out east where the government attempted to create a town like Elkwood, but without any norms. What happened to it? It didn't work. The townsfolk, knowing they didn't need to hide their true nature, ran the town, but so many different races of creatures in one place can only get along for so long. Fights broke out and people were attacked. Was a disaster. Is it still there? I don't know. I heard a few of the soldiers discussing it once. Like it or not, the normal people create a balance in the town that in turn keeps us all safe. Unless one of them gets eaten by a werewolf. Well, sure. Or bitten by a vampire. I suppose. Or burned by a... Okay, I get it. There are risks on both sides," said Becca, giving Colin a friendly punch on the arm. Colin sniffed the air. "They're bringing Terry out." The automatic door swished open and Varsun walked out with Principal Sampson, followed by Terry, who was flanked by 2 large guards. Terry looked very small between 2 such imposing figures. His face was streaked with tears and his clothes covered in dust. When he'd gone nuclear and tossed Colin through a couple of walls, he'd also blown out the walls of the classroom and collapsed part of the roof. A construction crew from the base was already on its way to try and repair the room before school tomorrow, but the general thought was that the classroom would likely need to be taped off for the time being. Colin's sweatshirt was slightly torn, and it had taken a few minutes for his bones to repair themselves after they were practically shattered due to being forcefully pushed through several layers of concrete. On the one hand, it really hurt. On the other hand, Colin was becoming more and more impressed with his healing abilities. Aside from silver, it seemed like he really was invulnerable. Any injury healed quickly. Terry was led into the back of a van along with his guards. Varsun looked pale and shaken. He was probably keenly aware that Mr. Emerson and Nightwatch had only been gone for a couple of days, and in that time there had already been a vampire attack and a telekinetic explosion, and the local demon had gone missing. "Hello," said Varsun. "Are you okay, Mr. Varsun?" asked Becca. Yes, I think so," said Varsun unconvincingly. "It's just been quite a week. Colin, I was hoping you would accompany Terry. I've spoken with his mother and she thinks it's best if Terry stays at the base for a while." Colin could sense Varsun's discomfort, hear the man's heartbeat quicken, and detect the slight waver in his voice. "You're going to put him in the prison," blurted Colin. "He doesn't have control over himself," said Varsun. "But he's just a kid. It's not forever. It's just until we can figure out how to help him control his power," said Varsun. "I don't like it any more than you do." "I doubt that," said Colin, remembering full well how he and Silas had been held at the prison accused of being murderers. Varsun took a deep breath. "I feel that young Terry would benefit from having you around while we take him up there. He seems to trust you. Maybe you can talk to him on our behalf? I promise he'll be well taken care of." "Fine," said Colin, but he could feel the anger inside as his wolf creature gently clawed at the door to get out. "I'll go with him." Varsun nodded and walked away to speak with Principal Sampson. "Are you okay?" said Becca. "It's not right," said Colin, frustrated. "It's not his fault." "Are you sure? You did say you'd hurt him before," muttering about trying to keep control. "Maybe he just needs some time to master his powers." "Maybe." Colin watched as Varsun chatted with Principal Sampson. He could hear them talking about the unfortunate event, and Principal Sampson was reassuring Varsun that he'd take good care of the students. "I think we have bigger problems." "Sampson," said Becca. "He just vanished in his office before everything with Terry happened. And that spell activated and your senses shut off before we went in to see him. And he's there every time something is about to happen. And you can't smell him or hear his heartbeat." "Do you think he cast the spell on me?" asked Colin. "I don't know. It's not like spells have signatures. So what do we do?" Colin wasn't sure what to do for the best. He couldn't tell Varsun because they had no evidence and he seemed to trust the new principal. Silas was out of the country. Charles had vanished. There was his grandmother, but she'd been acting weird lately. It didn't leave a ton of options. "We follow him," said Colin. "Stake out?" "Nice," said Becca with a grin. "That's my boy. Think you can keep an eye on him until I get back from the base? Does a werewolf make a vampire puke?" "Ugh, don't remind me. You know I can still smell Micah's vomit on me? No matter how many times I shower. The only drawback to super wolf smell." Becca kissed Colin on the cheek. "Hurry back." "Will do." The drive to the base was a quiet one. The two large soldiers said nothing. Terry just sat between them and stared blankly at the floor. Colin sat facing them but didn't know what to say. The van drove through the large cargo bay doors of the base and stopped in front of the elevator. Colin stood next to Terry with the two guards IGG and OK, as Colin had begun referring to them, flanking them. "It'll be okay," said Colin as the elevator descended. "I'm sorry," said Terry, still staring at the floor. "I didn't mean." "It's okay," said Colin. "I heal." What are you?" said Terry. "I'm a werewolf," said Colin. No matter how many times he said it, it still sounded funny. "Really?" Terry's eyes widened and he looked at Colin for the first time since he'd exited the school. "You actually turn into a werewolf?" "You bet. Cool, right?" I'm really sorry about what I did. I swear I didn't know I was doing it." Just. Tears began to well up in the boy's eyes again and Colin placed a hand on his shoulder, but he really didn't know what he should do to console him. The elevator shuddered to a stop. The doors slid open to reveal a long metallic room lined with barred cells on either side with a control console in the center. As per usual, there were a variety of inmates and the smells that hit Colin were unlike anything he'd experienced outside of the base. Blood-tinged with salt water, burning and garbage assaulted his senses. There were a couple of ragged-looking vampires in one cell. A large troll-like creature had a cell to himself but he could barely move. His broad shoulders touched the cell walls and his wide nose was pressed against the front bars. he grumbled in a low rumble that sounded like boulders crashing. A purple dragon the size of a small horse climbed around its cell looking for a comfortable place to perch. 5 humans occupied other cells, but their scent was not ordinary. They were certainly ogres because they smelled just like Gareth Dugan, a rotting sort of wet garbage smell. All these were regular residents of the cell block, but there was a newcomer. Since Colin had last been down here, one cell contained a large water tank, but the water was dark and murky and stank of seawater and oil. Colin could sense something moving around in there. Something large. Then there was the fire imp, still in its little box but now also inside a cell. The creature was bouncing small fireballs around its box. It noticed Colin and waved its hand excitedly. Colin grinned and waved back. Ever since the imp had burned Colin terribly, he felt a sort of connection with it. For whatever reason, the creature seemed to like him. "Open 17!" shouted the guard Colin had labeled OK. The lazy, lanky soldier who had also been Colin's prison guard sat at the console with his feet up. He slapped down the magazine he'd been reading and flicked a few switches. The bars of the empty cell next to the imp began to retract into the ceiling. "Well, if it isn't the werewolf boy!" shouted the prison guard. When they'd imprisoned Colin, the man had been less than nice and it had left a bad taste in his mouth. "Just ignore him," said Colin, turning back to the cell. Terry eyed the large metallic box and Colin could smell the fear. "It's okay. It's not as bad as it seems, and Varsun says you won't be here too long. This was my cell, you know." "It was," said Terry. "You were in here?" "Yeah," said Colin. "When I first turned." Terry warily stepped into the cell. "Close it up," shouted OK. The prison guard flicked a switch and the bars slid smoothly back down into place. "It'll be all right," said Colin. "You just need to get those powers under control and then yo." "But I can control them," blurted Terry, his face pressed up to the bars. "What do you mean?" "Come along, Strauss," said OK. "Hang on a second. Terry, what do you mean?" "I can control my powers. It's not easy, but I've never lost control before. It was the man. The man did it." "Come on, kid, we've got to go," repeated the guard. "What man?" Terry's bright blue eyes stared through the bars and Colin heard his heart skip a couple of beats. "The man with the glowing red eyes." After Colin said farewell to Terry and waved goodbye to the cheerful fire imp, a soldier escorted him back to the main level of the base. The sun was already setting below the tree line. They offered to give Colin a ride back down to town, but he refused. Before they could argue, Colin had already jumped the fence, landed 100 feet below the base at the edge of the forest, and taken off at a run. He wanted nothing more than to strip down and turn into a werewolf, but he didn't have any spare clothing, and he and Becca still had work to do. The man with the glowing red eyes. Finally, some proof that Colin hadn't been crazy that night in Seattle. Terry had seen him too. He ran through the now familiar forest trail, ducking branches, leaping over the occasional fallen tree, while his mind raced. Colin had seen the man with the glowing red eyes in Seattle and lost control of his powers. Then Principal Sampson had shown up and Colin couldn't sense him. Then Charles vanishes, Micah loses control, and now Terry. And before every single event, Colin's senses went out of whack because there was a spell cast on him. But what's the point of it all? Someone causing trouble in Elkwood? And is Principal Sampson the man with the glowing red eyes? That guy was young. Principal Sampson certainly wasn't. And why now? Maybe because Night Watch was out of town? It was all too confusing. The smell of a scared deer caused Colin to briefly change course until he remembered what he was supposed to be doing, and he headed back toward the school. His stomach rumbled in protest and Colin made a mental note to grab some food before he met Becca. The last thing he needed tonight was to be fighting the urge to eat his girlfriend. "Becca, can you hear me? Are you out there? Hello? Anyone? Is this thing on? Very funny. Where is he? Still in his office. Where are you?" "I'm on the roof of the gymnasium." "How did you get up there?" "I floated." "You can float?" "Of course I can't. I used the ladder." "Witches are confusing," said the werewolf. "I'll be there in a moment." Colin detoured around the school and into downtown, and loaded up on snacks at the gas station and left the store carrying 2 full bags of food. He carefully made his way around the back of the school, ducking under windows He could hear the school janitor clattering around somewhere inside, and smell a few construction people working in the biology classroom. The gymnasium sat adjacent to the main school building and was connected by a covered walkway, so the roof offered a good vantage point. Colin tucked a bag under each arm, glanced around, and listened carefully to make sure no one was around. As he was listening to the construction crew, he picked up on Becca's heartbeat. Colin crouched, muscles tensed, and jumped from the ground to the landing on the roof's edge. He hopped down from the small wall that ran around the top of the building and jogged over to where Becca sat. "Hungry?" said Becca as he approached her. "It was either this or I eat you," said Colin, tearing open a package of beef jerky. "Is he still there?" Becca and Colin peered over the wall. The sun had fully set and the school was dark except for one window to the right where the construction crew was working on the biology lab, and another to the left where Principal Sampson sat with his back to the window. "What's he doing?" asked Colin. "I have no idea. He's been like that for hours. This has been the most boring stakeout ever." "How was Terry?" "Scared, terrified, confused. Poor guy. They've put him next door to Bernie." Becca stared at Colin. "Who on earth is Bernie?" "The fire imp," said Colin through a mouthful of beef jerky. "You named it." Becca rolled her eyes. "It suits him. You shouldn't have named him. You'll get attached." Colin tore open another bag of jerky and quickly started to chew down the pieces of dried beef. He did this partly because he was hungry and partly because he didn't want to have to tell Becca that he already felt a weird attachment to the little fire creature. There was already enough going on as it was. Another bag of jerky, 3 bags of potato chips, and 6 chocolate bars. Later, Colin started to feel his hunger slipping away. "I'd kill to be able to eat like you," said Becca, still looking over the wall. "At the school." "Why don't you?" "Because I'd be a blimp. Do you not understand girls at all?" "That's a silly question." "Of course I don't." "He's moving." Colin scrambled into a crouch and looked over the wall. The office light was now off. "Where did he go?" "I think he left the office, but I don't see him." Colin's wolf eyes cut through the darkness, but he still couldn't make anything out. And unfortunately he couldn't hear or smell the principal. The front door of the high school swished open and the short, round form of Principal Sampson stepped out. "Anything," said Becca. Colin focused on the man as he walked down the steps from the entranceway. He cast out his senses like Silas taught him. There was a family of mice living under the steps of the school, and Colin could hear them as perfectly as if they were sitting right in front of him, but nothing from the principal. Nothing. "Does he drive?" "I don't think so. I've never seen him in a car." The principal crossed the schoolyard, exited through the gates, crossed the street, and headed for downtown. "Now what?" said Becca. "We follow him," said Colin, standing up. "Come on." He picked Becca up and, without warning, stepped off the roof. Becca gasped and Colin landed lightly on the ground, placing Becca on her feet. "Your heart rate just skyrocketed," said Colin. "Are you okay? You just jumped off a roof." Colin looked up. It was high. "Sorry, I know it's only been a few months, but I sometimes forget things like that aren't normal." And it was true. After years of being awkward and uncoordinated, as a werewolf, Colin finally felt comfortable in his own skin. Jumping off a roof? No biggie. Hunting a deer? Totally normal. Howling at the moon? What's weird about that? "Looks like he's heading downtown," said Becca. "You should go. You can move quicker and more quietly than I can. I have my phone. Call me when you find out where he goes." Colin nodded and took off. He picked up speed and turned outside of the school gate, taking a slightly longer path to downtown. He cut through Richard Baker Park, which ran adjacent to the north end of the town and led to the back entrance of Town Hall. He began to pick up the scent of people. He glanced at the clock tower above Town Hall. It was almost 7 o'clock, meaning downtown would still be busy. Someone would likely notice him sneaking around. How do I get around without being seen? He looked up at the clock tower again. Oh, of course. He made sure no one could see him and leapt onto the town hall roof. From there he jumped over to the bakery and snuck up to the edge that looked down on the main street. A few people milled around, meeting friends at the coffee shop, visiting the grocery store, ordering pizza at the only pizza place in town. Each person had their own scent except one person, Principal Sampson. He walked happily down the street, keeping his distance from other people but offering a friendly hello or a wave as he passed. He rounded a corner and disappeared from sight. Can't lose him. Colin leapt over to the hardware store roof, then onto the thrift store so he could see down the street. The principal was gone. Oh no, where did he go? Maybe he went into a store? Colin jumped down to a small dumpster at the side of the thrift store, dropped to the ground and casually walked out to the street, following the path of the principal. He had almost reached the other side of the downtown core and was worried he'd totally lost his quarry when he saw Principal Sampson a block over. He was crossing the street, heading away from downtown and toward Elkwood Cemetery. But there's nothing there. It's just a graveyard. Hey Strauss, came the voice of Gareth Dugan, followed by the smell of garbage. Colin turned and came face to face with his former bully. Hi Gareth. Listen. I really don't. You think you're pretty tough, don't you? I honestly don't have time for this right now. Gareth took a step closer and jabbed a finger into Colin's chest. Just because you're some big old monster you think you can just push me around and humiliate me. Wouldn't dream of it. How about we talk it over another day? Colin looked around to see Principal Sampson enter the graveyard. Got to go. Gareth clamped a powerful hand around Colin's arm. The werewolf inside began to growl. Colin could smell the fear and uncertainty on Gareth. We're not done talking, said Gareth. Colin took a deep breath. What is it exactly you want, Gareth? He could see through the darkness that Principal Sampson had reached the farthest corner of the graveyard. I stuttered Gareth. Colin was shocked as he recognized a sharp scent that cut through the garbage. Smell. You want to be friends? Gareth looked surprised, then embarrassed, then angry. No, I don't. You do. Colin was still in shock. No, I don't. Unless, you wanted to hang out sometime. I really must be going crazy. What on earth was happening? Colin couldn't tell if Gareth wanted to hit him or give him a hug. Yeah, great talk, said Colin. I've got to go. Colin shrugged off Gareth's grip and ran to the graveyard. He zigzagged between the gravestones, some small and simple, others marked by large statues of angels, many of which looked more creepy than heavenly, but he couldn't find any sign of the principal. He reached the corner where he'd last seen the man and almost tripped over a small gravestone that was partially covered by grass and crawling ivy. Something about the stone caught his eye. He looked closer and what he saw turned Colin's blood cold in his veins. He jumped when his cell phone buzzed in his pocket. He answered. Are you still following him? Said Becca. Colin looked around the graveyard and back at the gravestone in front of him. I found him, said Colin. Awesome, where is he? He's dead. What? How? Colin crouched down, brushed away some of the ivy and read the gravestone. Ivan Sampson. Loving husband. A teacher to all. 1883 to 1941. Apparently our new principal has been dead since 1941.